Hello, everyone. This is Javera Kulsum Atif, and we're back again with another episode of Policy Beats. Today, I am joined here by Ms. Tamanna Salikuddin. She is the Director of South Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she oversees the work on Pakistan and broader South Asia. She comes into this role with extensive regional expertise in political and demographic trends in the region. How are you, ma'am?
I'm great. It's great to be in Pakistan. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we actually get down to the real questions, I would just like to know briefly if you could tell our audience, how did you get into this international relations, security affairs, as a diplomat, etc.? How does it all come together?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I was born and raised in the States, but my parents are of South Asian extraction, and as every good desi bacha, I was supposed to be a doctor
Right.
and go to medical school. But I graduated from university with a degree in economics and biology just as 9/11 happened, and it really did change my life. And instead of going, living in the States as a Muslim, thinking about what my role was, I just had this passion to do something different than medicine. I was always interested in languages and foreign policy and thinking about relations between states. I went to law school and practiced international law. My first time living overseas was actually in Sri Lanka as a young law student, and I got to work with the UN on some of the then negotiations between the LTTE and the Sri Lankan government. So that was the first taste I got of, I think, diplomacy and peace negotiations, and I think it just
You
won me
stand
over.
as a symbol of hope for the Desis trying to slip out from
From the
the medicine.
medicine.
I'm
Bilkul,
actually
bilkul.
one of them.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, so then, I mean, after law school, I actually joined the US government. I worked in government for about a decade and a half as a diplomat. I was posted here in Islamabad. Some of my best memories were living in Pakistan.
Right.
Later on, I was director for Afghanistan, Pakistan at the White House, at the National Security Council. And then a really interesting part of my career, I got to work at the State Department on Taliban reconciliation.
Right.
So being one of the very few women who were in the room negotiating with the Afghan Taliban, had really interesting experiences, was in the room at the Murray talks.
Right.
Somehow I ended up meeting the Taliban on a lot of golf courses. So if you can imagine the Murray talks, Ramzan mein the. So in the middle of the night, in Murray on a Bourbon golf course,
Right.
with all the Taliban, the Chinese, the Pakistani government.
So you had the first-hand experience.
I did, and I was the only woman in that room. So
How
it
did
was
that feel,
crazy.
actually?
They thought it would be fun to sit me right next to the Taliban, which was fine, actually. It's interesting. Just like any part of our governments aren't monoliths, the Taliban is not a monolith. So you found some Taliban who are very comfortable talking to women and engaging with international diplomats. It also helps when you're an American, you're not seen. This was true even when I lived in Pakistan and,
Right.
Spent a lot of time in FATA and other places. They didn't see you as a woman. You're sort of a third gender.
Right.
You aren't
American citizen.
American. Yeah, because you're an American, you're sort of different. It was so they couldn't quite put you in a box. But,
Right.
in the end, I found the Taliban to be similar to other Afghans, right? They are still Afghans and they dealt with you as an American talking to an Afghan. It wasn't always easy, I have to say that. Obviously I didn't agree with them on lots of things,
Right.
but I think you can find a space for negotiation. And that was our
so
job.
drawing from that experience of yours, given what we're seeing today in Afghanistan and how the US pullout from Afghanistan happened, the question still on the table is of recognition and how that works. And then also drawing attention from your experience as a woman. We're talking constantly about the humanitarian crisis coupled with how women and children are not allowed access to schools, to education, work, etc.
Say,
How are you seeing this all pan out? Where is this headed? Ek to Afghanistan itself.
right.
And then secondly, with the US policy towards Afghanistan, what is it that we can map out? What are we going to see in the near future?
Right. I mean, I think, the lens, if I talk about it from a US policy perspective,
Right.
the lens has really shifted with the withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of trying and it not working out. Let's be
Right.
honest. It didn't work out how the US wanted it, and we left. And so, unfortunately, the regional countries don't have the luxury of leaving, right? So to a certain extent, in the policy sphere in Washington, there isn't a lot of attention on Afghanistan. Nobody wants to deal with the big problems there. I think there are people like the Special Representative Tom West at that level who are concerned. Rina Amiri, who's the Special Representative for Women and Girls, they are very concerned about the humanitarian crisis and the people of Afghanistan. I think it's really important that we don't abandon the people of Afghanistan. Now, I think regional countries have a real right to be or should be worried about what's going on, right? You have, I mean, I think the attack on your embassy,
on the embassy, exactly.
Just recently, it's a very sad, attack. And thankfully, your chief of mission was fine. But I think the security situation is deteriorating. It's not that the Taliban, yes, they have some modicum of control and the war has ended. I think that is good for Afghans.
Right.
But there are plenty of other groups. And I think the rise of TTP and the attacks here in Pakistan show that an Afghanistan that is, that is unstable is bad for the region and first and foremost bad for Pakistan. I think we have to find creative solutions on both fronts. So there's the humanitarian and the people of Afghanistan. What can we do for them? And then there's the CT component. I think the U.S. and Pakistan quietly have a lot of ways to cooperate on counterterrorism.
Right.
And strangely enough, we are maybe on the same page.
So there's like an over-the-horizon strategy in the works.
Yeah, to some extent. But I think it's going to be, look, we're not on the ground in Afghanistan anymore. We don't have a troop presence. So there are certain threats that maybe we can manage.
Right.
And certain threats that we don't need to worry ourselves about. I think on the other hand, you talked about women and girls. That is a real issue. Access to schools, every time there's been engagement, the U.S. is still engaging with the Taliban, even if we haven't recognized them. Similar to every other country, right? Pakistan hasn't recognized them. Other countries haven't. There's almost de facto sort of engagement.
Right.
The U.S. is engaging in its own ways. Unfortunately, every time we get close to a breakthrough, there's something like the announcement against girls going to school, which, let's be very honest, is a huge political barrier in the United States to doing anything with the Taliban.
Right.
So, and I think what we're really worried about is that things go from bad to worse, that the security situation continues to break down. You see more terrorist attacks, and the Taliban increasingly puts in more oppressive edicts, which I would argue not the whole Taliban even agrees with.
Okay.
But, edicts like banning women from parks, closing universities or all private institutions, et cetera.
Right. So that's interesting. This makes me more curious now. We're talking about the U.S. policy shifting from the region, but at the same time, there's an important ally or partner of the U.S., India, not the least affected by Afghanistan. We can't certainly say that, right? So with Afghanistan deteriorating, would it not naturally bring back U.S. attention, or at least India wanting, or any country for that matter, wanting stability in South Asia, or for U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific to be working, you would have to have some stability in South Asia?
That's true. I think that's absolutely right. I think India has serious concerns terrestrially about attacks that might come from Afghanistan, terrorist groups, instability, obviously. I think in the U.S. system, and while it doesn't make a lot of sense when you sit in the subcontinent, there's a seam, there's a border between this, even organizationally, when we think about it. India is now part of this Indo-Pacific strategy. And
which is strange because it's literally next
still door, there, right? And Pakistan, Afghanistan, we find ourselves in a policy shift that hasn't resolved all the old issues. So Washington wants to put the 20 years of war
it's
behind
almost
itself.
Geographically incorrect, if I may.
Yes, I'm not going to argue with you, but it is all now about China and countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific, and for that reason, it's a very real politique. You can argue normatively why why there are shortcomings in this relationship. Fine. But I think the real politique of it is that a U.S.-India partnership is very important for countering China. And so there's a lot of convergence, I think, security-wise, economically, a lot of other factors when we think about the Indo-Pacific. But that being said, I think Afghanistan comes up in discussions, not just with Pakistan, with India, with all the Central Asian states.
Right.
So it's not that the U.S. doesn't know or care. I wouldn't even say they do care. It's just the policy list of
The priority.
priority list. It's not at, it's, I think for 20 years, we enjoyed outsized policy attention on Afghanistan, and it just isn't there. The resources aren't there. The attention isn't there. And unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't have a good solution, right? Everyone I'm talking to in Pakistan is saying the U.S. needs to come back and offer some sort of leadership in the region. And I don't think you're going to get that, right?
Yeah, I do actually agree with you on that. It's a tried and tested method. It didn't work first.
It didn't work.
Probably won't. Which then brings me to regional tensions then. You already have Pakistan-India tensions going on. Ma'am, what do you have to say about the ongoing stalemate? If we want stability in South Asia, and Pakistan-India ties always come to the forefront.
Sure.
And then perhaps more importantly would be IndoChina ties. Your comments on that?
That's a great question. I mean, I personally am very vested. I have family in both countries. I feel like I'm a child of South Asia, not of one country. I feel equally comfortable in both countries. And I do think, South Asia is the least integrated economic region in the world.
Right.
And it affects the citizens of all countries of South Asia.
It certainly does.
I think it is a disservice to not just Indians and Pakistanis, but Bangladeshis and Sri Lankans and Nepalis, that this conflict has frozen the region. So I think if we are serious about economic growth and stability and prosperity for future generations, you have to break through this logjam. I don't know how practical that is. I think the politics of both capitals right now, the domestic politics, just don't allow for it.
Right.
There isn't space for movement. I think, look, in 2019, you had basically what you could say was the worst year of the Pakistan-India relationship in a long, long time. You've broken off diplomatic ties. And then in 2020, you had, in recent memory, the worst of India-China ties with the Galwan incident. And yet, in 2021, you have a ceasefire on the line of control between India and Pakistan. You have a back channel that has worked to some extent. I mean, the errant missile that came across, it was very, I think, mature of Pakistan the way it reacted. But part of that has to do with the back channel.
Right.
All of these things, I think, are an understanding of the other, I wouldn't say distractions, but the other pulls on attention in Pakistan and in India. So in Pakistan, obviously, you have economic and political distractions, you could say, or instability, what have you.
Disarray that's going on.
Nazuk mode se
Exactly.
guzar rahe,
It's
right?
a roundabout.
It's a roundabout now. So that is first and foremost at the top of everyone's list. But I would not discount the fact of rising terrorist attacks. Nobody wants to go back to those years of 2009 and 10. And
Certainly not the people of Pakistan.
No. And so I think it's a serious concern, the rise of TTP. And so I think rightfully so, they're focused there. And so it's good that you have a quiet sort of stalemate with India right now. Similarly, I think India is focused elsewhere. And I think it's in their interest not necessarily to raise anything right now with Pakistan. That being said, I don't see a lot of hope because of where the politics are, right? So I had hoped, and the U.S. had hoped, that maybe the floods offered some sort of small opening to do trade with between India and Pakistan, maybe on things like onions and tomatoes and the small commodities that Pakistanis needed during this flood crisis. But it's just
didn't
really
manifest.
hard. You need a strong political mandate to take such a hard decision. And I don't think that exists right now in Pakistan. I don't think, with elections always around the corner in both countries, nobody is standing up to do it.
The conversation always somehow goes on to the political mandate on both sides.
Both sides.
We like to say that India is not taking this seriously, and the other side would obviously pose the same point.
Sure.
And so on Indochina ties, I would like to, in South Asia, you have the existing superpower competition going on between US China.
Yes.
In South Asia, we see India and China polls. Where do you see this dynamic heading? I understand that there's the Indo-Pacific part of it, but within the South Asian region, are we going to witness any escalation or de-escalation on that point?
Right. Well, I would point you to a great USIP recent study that we came out with, it's a senior study group report on on Southern Asia and why we called it Southern Asia. I think we're looking at strategic stability now, not just between India and Pakistan. Usually when we would think about it in the US, we'd think about India-Pakistan line of control and escalation. I think you have to now think of it as three countries, right? You have three nuclear armed states with contested borders, line of actual control, line of control. And I think the great power conflict complicates this, right?
Right.
So you have what we call in the paper is a cascading security dilemma. So you have Pakistan looking to counter India, India looking to counter China, China looking to counter the US. Everybody's looking towards the next bigger player in the
Right.
game, but there are unintended consequences for all the players in the game. And so we really have to be concerned, not just in crises, but most importantly in crises. But we have to be thinking about, can the U.S. and China be constructive players in any India-Pakistan crisis?
Right.
And what are the points of conflict? I think it's really interesting if you look at the National Defense Strategy, which was just released in the U.S. For the first time. We obviously talk about Taiwan. We talk about other Indo-Pacific
Actors.
disputes that China has or that China is claiming, but we have added the line of actual control. So the territorial dispute between India and China is really important for the U.S. That is how
Right.
we are a partner with India, right? To be on their side. But it's really interesting, even despite their rivalry, their fighting at the line of actual control, they have millions and billions of dollars of trade.
Exactly.
Right. And I think that's a key difference between that
The Indo-China relations and
and
that
the
of
India-Pakistan, right?
Oh.
You have less skin in the game,
Right.
right? This is a relationship where
The
you two can
stakes.
ignore the stakes. What is there? You can ignore each other and play for your domestic audiences without any real stake in the game.
Interesting. So that's an interesting point to note. And so obviously, then it comes to the other actors within South Asia. We've got Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. How does it impact them
Yeah,
when it comes to the
sure.
Indo-China rivalry in
Yeah.
South Asia?
Definitely. I mean, I look at Sri Lanka. The crisis in Sri Lanka, both political and economic, I think are the canary in the coal mine. You see it playing out. This is where India and China have been competing for influence, have been competing for economic support. We've seen that the Rajapaksas, much of the loans, the famous Hambantota port, and so much more, many of their loans were Chinese loans. So the three largest bilateral lenders to Sri Lanka were Japan, China, and India.
Right.
Interestingly, India and Japan are part of the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Quad. So I think it's a real interesting place for the competition. And countries like Sri Lanka, I think, are trying to see what they can get from both sides of the competition, but protect themselves
Right.
in the midst of it. And I think that's true for many countries, not just in South Asia, but Southeast Asia. But when it came to the crisis, they've turned back to India now. For a while, they were very close to China. They've turned to India, who has come in and with relief for them in crisis period. But I think Bangladesh as well. It's very interesting. They are, do they go more towards China or more towards India? And they are really trying to balance. Even earlier this year, there were sanctions put on parts of the Bangladeshi security forces by the U.S. And instead of turning towards China and saying, okay, now we're all in on China, it was really interesting. The Bangladeshis came to the U.S. and are trying very hard to try to balance that relationship. I would point you to the summit between the Bangladeshi Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister in September,
Right.
and the economic and trade ties and other ties that they're really trying to push, water management ties. Again, trying to balance both India and China. Every country doesn't want to choose. I don't think you can force countries to choose,
Right.
just like Pakistan can't choose. But I think that's going to be a reality with great power competition.
Right. And so lastly, since we're short in time, and I have a lot of questions packed for you,
Sure.
but we're going to take one conclusive question from you, ma'am. And so I know you've already answered parts of it, but what does the U.S. policy look like for South Asia, despite it being on the lower priority of its current policy? But also, what is it that the South Asian countries can do to pitch themselves as less of a securitized region, but more of a region of opportunity? Because we saw the integration of ASEAN, and that's actually helping them to a great degree, actually. But here, the SARC failed. Everything else seems to be compromised. Where does South Asia go from this point onwards, from this global uncertainty? Where do we go?
It's a great question. And I'm afraid, I think the thing that I would warn most is, and everyone talks about this, is that great power competition, even if we don't want it to break South Asia into political blocks of Pakistan, China, and US, India, I think there are unintended consequences for Pakistan, most notably here. I think the
Right.
US-Pakistan relationship suffers and will continue to suffer in that regard. Um, Look, Afghanistan has been the lens for 20 years. It's not going to be the lens anymore.
Right.
It is going to be countering China. That's just the way the US is going to see South Asia and where it fits into that. I think for Pakistan, there are, outside of just that, the question for Pakistan is how do you protect the US-Pakistan relationship from that competition?
Right.
But also, how do you build resiliency into the relationship so that part of the security things will always matter, right? So whether it's counterterrorism, whether it's preventing nuclear escalation or conventional escalation, those will always matter. But beyond that, can climate change, can people-to-people ties, can there be other stakeholders in this relationship that give it resiliency and protect it from the competition, right? Your foreign minister, when he came to Washington, talked about dehyphenation. He talked about we're
Right.
not. And I think that's right. We're not, Washington isn't seeing Pakistan through an Afghanistan lens. It's not seeing you through a China lens. It's not seeing you through a India lens. But dehyphenation often means that it's not paying that much attention to you either. So is there space in what I would say is a more moderate relationship to actually carve out practical cooperation on things that are useful for both Pakistanis and the United States?
In the
I
United
also think lowering the rhetoric in both countries. Let's be honest. If anti-Americanism is really popular
It's not
domestically,
going to work in the foreign policy side.
it doesn't work in
Absolutely.
foreign policy. I don't think we can ignore that. And in this day and age of social media, it's impossible for a message to only be for domestic audiences.
I understand that entirely. And yet again, I guess it goes both ways because the
Completely.
US-Pakistan ties have been somewhat restricted to an elitist circle and not people to people, as you say.
Of course.
Instead, that is what needs to be reinforced. And I guess we're about to see more tumultuous times for South Asia, though. That I hope I hope there's a policy breakthrough for Pakistan and India, for India China, for US China. But I guess realpolitik would say otherwise.
Yeah, I don't. Let's not hold our breath for a policy breakthrough from the top. It's not coming,
Right.
But I think for young people who are energetic and have a lot of resources when it comes to, in Pakistan, the intelligence and the dynamic nature of the
Right.
youth. There's a lot of places we can look beyond governments, right? We should
Certainly.
be building those people-to-people ties. I think it's unfortunate that the only people in the U.S. system who know Pakistan are those who worked on CT or worked on
Basically.
Afghanistan, right?
Right.
Why are we not having more Americans come to Pakistan? We have lots of Pakistanis come to America, but we should have them the other way around. Similarly, you understand what the people-to-people ties are really something we can do without waiting for governments.
Certainly.
And policy changes.
I guess that is where the business community comes into action. Your artists, entrepreneurs, everybody else, apart from the government, and that's important. Thank you so much, Ms. Tamanna, for your time. It was an amazing conversation. We would love to have you again. This was Policy Beats with Javeria Atif.